hopefully we can make some of these clips available as well. Being recorded. Thank you for letting us know, Alastair. Eric. I have asked 4 questions to our panelists, but because they join in the work and the development of indicators of integration at different stages, we're going to focus some of the questions and direct them just to start from the beginning, and then we will invite you to join with other insights. But please feel free, if I don't ask you directly and you want to say something, just let me know and I can pass you the mic. I've asked them to please keep their intervention between 2-3 minutes each, so we can have a dialogue, and hopefully we can have some time at the end for Q&A. So welcome to our panelists, and maybe I can start with you, Carolyne, because you first commissioned this work back in 2002. So can you tell us a little bit about the story of how this all began? And I can pass you.
Oh, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to see the indicators being celebrated. Your question, how did it all begin? I just want to say the Immigration Department set up the Immigration Research Service early 2000, and they recruited a lot of researchers, and the aim was to try and support immigration policies with appropriate evidence. So when we joined, I think one of my remits was to work on integration, and at the time, we didn't really know much about integration in terms of how to define it, who is doing what. So the first thing we did was to commission a piece of work called Mapping the Field. If you haven't seen it, you should take a look at it, because it was a really, really comprehensive, I think, analysis of existing data. And when we commissioned that piece of work, there were key things that came across from that work. And one of the most important points was what I think, there's a particular quotation that a lot of people tend to quote, and that is from Robinson, where he says, integration is a very chaotic term. And that was the state of integration at the time, partly because people tended to use integration from different perspectives. So what I want to do is just to explain what happened with mapping the field. So we set out an invitation to tender in December 2000. And Stephen Vettervex and his colleagues got the contract. And their main focus was to tell us what is out there on integration, what the NGOs are doing, what the international community is doing, and the different models of integration that exist, so that we can learn from them and provide the right evidence to our policy colleagues. And it was a really, really comprehensive piece of work that they did. So they looked at over 3,000 published material on integration. And they also looked at NGOs, and they looked at different unpublished reports. And they came up with a number of conclusions. And I think one of the key conclusions was the gap in integration research, in comprehensive integration research, the need for interdisciplinary research. And then when it came to indicators, I don't want to say much about that finding, but I want to talk about indicators. They actually mentioned that there are no clear indicators to measure integration. And where people are trying to use indicators, they tended to use it in a way that was not comprehensive. So they basically recommended that it would be important to develop these indicators. We proceeded by commissioning what we call the systematic review of integration research as well. And out of over 3,000 published information, we found out that only about 5 met the criteria of robust research. And so on that basis, we decided to look at how we can commission something more robust to inform Home Office policies. And one of the key things that I was looking for was the voices of host communities, because at the time, we heard a lot about refugees, only from a one-sided perspective. We didn't really hear about how host communities can also adapt to welcome refugees. So we're looking for a very comprehensive piece of work that will give us the voices of all the actors, not just refugees, host communities, all the different actors, the government and everybody. And so we put out a tender with very specific questions that they had to answer. And the point was to see how they can help us to move forward in this domain. And Alastair won the contract. And I think he was also very fortunate to have some really passionate, I think, people in his team who then sort of took forward this research in a really spectacular way. And that led us to, I think, the publication in 2004. So I don't want to say too much because I think Alastair will have better things to say about that. Yeah?
Alastair, would you like to continue that story, please? Thank you. Thank you, Carolyne.
Thanks so much, Caroline. It's a long time ago, and I realized that my history looking back was different from if I actually took stock of some things happening at that time. And there's three quick points I want to make. One is about politics. It's not an easy time politically at the moment, is it? And occasionally I think back, oh, it was wonderful in the 1990s or the 2000s. But then I go back to see the context of this work was the Bradford and Burnley riots in the north of England, and the discussion about what community cohesion meant in the UK, what it meant for people to be part of the UK, and therefore the notion of integration, what really that meant. It was also a time where it's easier for me than Caroline to mention this, when the Home Secretary used the word swamped. A Labour Home Secretary used the word swamped about refugees coming into the south of England. So we might think, oh, 20 years ago, it was all a very benign, very uncontroversial area. There was tense politics, and that's no criticism of that. It was a public concern about our understanding of what the country was, how the country welcomed, how the country rejected, what society was about. And so I think it's really important to remember that the integration, although a technical term, had very much a political valence at that time, as it still does. The second bit of the story, if I'm honest, and this is maybe more for the academics than for the policymakers, is about academic political economy. How the hell did we get that contract? And if I look at, so we were engaged in the mapping the field work through our links with the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford. That was hugely helpful for us in terms of our credibility, in terms of our insight into this call coming up. I'd forgotten all about Michael Bell Associates, which was the contractor that we worked with. Many of you will have forgotten Paul Garner from the University of Liverpool, who was a co-investigator, because my judgment at the time was that we were not a credible applicant without the University of Liverpool are very strong in terms of their systematic reviews and evidence-based things. So there's a sense to which our political economy as an institute, I'll come on to the values in a second, was of, we can't do this on our own. We need to develop track record. We need to build upon existing work. And as you have heard hinted at from Rebecca's work and another work that Alison pointed to, we've done a lot of work with refugees internationally. And I think we had very creditable work in that area. But in the UK, we had not done so much. The one set of publications we had on integration was actually around the integration of people with learning disabilities into communities in Scotland on the closure of Gogarburn, a major public policy. So I'm just encouraging academics in terms of building their careers that when you look back, you're trying to make a coherent story, and I think of it now a very successful one, out of some elements. You're cooking something. And absolutely having Alison on board, having connections with other people was a huge asset for that. But and Una's work and community engagement work. But it was a stretch for us, and I'm so delighted that we got that, and the political economy of it as a small institution. I respect the Home Office for finding value and credit in our work, not as one of the typical subjects, not, for example, at the Refugee Studies Centre at Oxford that had led the previous work, which presumably could have have led this work. We would be a small player compared to that. Why I think we might have won it, and we didn't cook this pre in advance, is something about values, which has made me incredibly proud about working at QMU and with IGHD for many years, was that commitment to practice, that commitment to solidarity, and therefore inevitably an understanding that we couldn't approach the idea of integration without speaking with host communities. We wanted to speak with refugees. That was very much on our agenda. But you can't talk about that without talking on the other side. And remarkably, that seemed quite novel in 2002, that idea that you'd actually talk about integration with the communities where there was expectations of that happening. So that was those three elements, I think, shaped the early parts of the story.
Thank you so much, Alastair. And Alison, how do you remember those early days?
Well, it's very interesting. I just learned something over lunchtime talking to Carolyne about it, because as I sort of prepared my thoughts, just from my own perspective, I came into this research as my first major research after I'd done my own doctoral studies. And through those doctoral studies, I had got more and more involved in an approach which we might call phenomenological perspective, so that I was really interested in the whole phenomenon, and particularly in how the people involved in whatever it is you're looking at make meaning of their experiences. So you can see, I think, kind of how that comes together. And I was just really interested, Carolyne and I were talking earlier, that Carolyne was already set her sights on some research that explored community perspectives. And I think that was the thing that, you know, as Alastair has just said, felt so important. And it's interesting. I mean, looking around the room, Una, Rebecca, Layla was involved very early on too. And Una and I did some European work a few years later, which was supposed to replicate the indicative integration study with Germany, Malta, and Italy. And those research teams that were very respected research teams really said to us, well, you can't talk to ordinary people. You know, I mean, you might perhaps be able to go to a refugee support organization and get a few hand-picked refugees to talk to you, but how on earth would you talk to members of the community? And we said, well, this is the essence of what we did, because this is what enabled us to have that breadth of insight. And I was just going to say, just to sort of move the story on a little bit. So the bit that I was particularly involved with, apart from literature reviews and so on, was this field work and our challenge. And ask Layla afterwards, she can tell you stories about meeting people in pubs and goodness knows what, was to talk to people, to try and understand their experiences of living, belonging, in an area where refugees are settling. And so we chose two contrasting locations. One was London, where there's a long history of diversity and inward and outward migration. But then at that time, this is sort of part of the political context, because the southeast of the country was seen to be swamped by asylum seekers, the UK government introduced what they call the dispersal policy, which deals with local authorities around the country. One has to say, quite honestly, local authorities that had empty housing, which of course was housing people didn't want to occupy on the whole, but that there was capacity, and that included Glasgow at the time. And so Glasgow started to host asylum seekers for the first time ever. So we worked in both Glasgow and London, and we asked both refugees and not asylum seekers, people who'd already got status. That was another discussion. Just things like, what makes you feel at home here? You know, what gives you a sense of belonging? We asked about their lives. We asked about their hopes for their lives and how those would pan out. And we also asked specifically, what does integration mean to you, as a kind of final question, to gather people's definitions. But it was out of those broad conversations that we were then able to draw the themes that led us to the domains that people might be familiar with in the indicators of integration.
Thank you, Alison. It's very interesting what you say in terms of how much hasn't changed in terms of the political context, but even the dispersion policy, because that's exactly what we are discussing nowadays with local authorities and some of the workshops that Nicole and Gianluca have been running, and have been, you know, a part of our new project as well. But a lot has changed in relation to the indicator of integrations themselves. One, you came out with a new version in 2019, but also has influenced largely policy across Scotland, the UK, and also across the world. So one of your paper of 2004 is one of 2008 is one of the most cited papers in terms of integration across the world, really. And talking about how it has been changes and how it has developed in these last 20 years, I want to invite Ed to come in, Ed, because I know you have, and maybe invite you to reflect and how have you used the indicator of integration and some of the evaluation work that you have done from resettlement programs, and how do you think has been used nowadays? So Ed, welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you well, yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, just to say thank you for inviting me, by the way, and I'm really sorry I can't join you there in person, but yeah, heard some really interesting, fantastic presentations today, so thank you again. I mean, my colleagues on the panel might be able to say a little bit more about why the original kind of indicators framework was revised in 2019, which was shortly before I joined the Home Office. So I'd also be actually quite interested to hear about the history of that as well. But it actually turned out to be quite kind of serendipitous timing in 2019, because obviously we had the lockdown and the COVID-19 pandemic shortly afterwards. So one of the key things that was added was around kind of digital skills and access, and actually that kind of came to the fore in the kind of the immediate years afterwards. So we did a piece of research, for example, around the integration of women refugees. So we looked at both resettled refugees and a group of women that had been granted asylum. And obviously we were looking at kind of the impact of COVID as well, and kind of just the way they kind of interact with both kind of services and the wider community. And a lot of it was so dependent in those years on kind of digital access and literacy, and some really interesting findings about isolation and how they'd often kind of prioritize those kind of devices and access for, you know, for children, for sort of education and schooling, or potentially for men who tend to be kind of, were more likely to be working and potentially having to work from home. So actually there was kind of a kind of burden of isolation more than you might have expected. So that was, again, that was just one kind of one of the strengths of the updated framework. But yeah, speaking more general terms, it's a fantastic framework, and it generally underpins all the work that we do. So my role at the Home Office is evaluating the kind of the delivery and the outcomes of the department's main resettlement schemes. So, you know, until recently that was the VPERS and VCRS schemes, and now that's going to be superseded by the UK RS or UK resettlement schemes. And we also have 2 schemes that have been set up in response to recent developments in Afghanistan. So you've got the Afghan Citizens Relocation Scheme, Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme, and ARAP, which is the Afghan Relocations and Assistance Program. So in terms of our evaluation, what we try and do is kind of measure as many kind of domains as integration as we can. And we kind of adopt a mixed methods approach, collecting quantitative data and qualitative data. And what we also do, in addition to evaluating resettlement, is on the integration side, doing research around the integration of refugees more widely. So that's not just resettled refugees, but those who are granted asylum or humanitarian protection or various kind of different types of status. So that's both kind of, I suppose, research in a pure sense. So start trying to understand the barriers to integration, what works, and kind of promoting integration and supporting refugees, but also evaluating the various different integration support programs that have come into being in the last few years. So there's the Refugee Transitions Outcomes Fund, which launched a year or so ago, which is kind of a pilot being delivered in 4 different areas. And then there's the new REP, which stands for Refugee Employability Program, which is due to launch next year, which is kind of an enhanced package of integration support for refugees arriving via kind of regular asylum routes. So yes, just to say it's hugely important and hugely useful. There's obviously a lot of challenges collecting data on integration with respect to a group like refugees, particularly on kind of social connections actually. So maybe we could talk a bit about that later, but yeah, hopefully that's provided some context into the various different ways that we use it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Ed. And as you said at the beginning, I think it's difficult to summarize how everything has changed in 20 years. But if maybe I can ask our panelists to emphasize maybe some of the changes, or even, I know Carolyne and Alison also were involved in the framework 2019. So there's anything that you would like to emphasize, Carolyne?
Yeah, okay. So why did we update the framework? I probably just want to say a bit about that. I remember a conference I attended in Surrey. I think I went to one, it was Sussex, isn't it? Yeah. And I think I was sitting in that conference. I think almost all the presentations in that conference, they were all based on the framework, the sort of previous framework. And so while I was sitting there, I was just thinking, a lot has changed. This is how many years since Alastair and Alison published that framework, and people are still using it without incorporating the changes that have happened in recent times. And I thought, this is really not very helpful. Whilst the principles are still okay, there are so many things that needs to be updated. So we need to think about a way of updating it. And so I think I had a chat with a few of them and went back to the Home Office. And I had a chat with John Simmons, and we talked about it, and we thought, no, I think we need to do something about this. And I think on the basis of that, we decided to also carry out a review of the existing evidence based on integration, what works on integration, so that when we update the framework, it will be based on the most updated evidence. So that review was carried out, and I think I set up a working group, which came out of 7 institutions, I think in Wales, Scotland, England, everywhere, Ireland as well. And then I think, Alison, you were there. There were about 4 academics in the group. And then we also had like representatives from the different strands of society, just to make sure that, again, we cover all the aspects that integration needs to be covered, especially with all the lessons we've learned in previous years. And it worked really well. We had quite a few passionate integration experts in the group. And they made sure that the framework actually sort of reflected what was important to the communities, what was important to all sectors of society. And we also had a lot of collaboration from all government departments. If you look at the updated framework, you would notice that somehow it actually aligns to a lot of other government strategies. So it was very much a collaborative piece of work. Across not just government departments, but with non-governmental organizations. And I think the then minister actually called it a really practical and useful tool for integration. So if you look at the new framework at the moment, you would notice that the indicators have been added. The principles are very much the same in recognition of the way it's been widely used, but we've added domains. And I think we went further to look at examples of good practice locally and nationally, to demonstrate that integration is not only down to the individual or to the host community, it's also down to all the other factors at the national and local level. So we actually think that even the collection of, I think, databases, existing resources, existing questions that are being asked to facilitate a comparison across local authorities, national services, and international domains was really, really important to us. So we're looking forward to seeing how that is being used to standardize integration services and integration evaluation across the board.
Great, thank you. Alison, would you like to continue from that? And I will come back to you, Alastair, in a minute. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks for the opportunity to give all credit to Carolyne for absolutely driving that one through, because I don't think it was easy to make that happen politically with a small p, never mind a large p. And so there's a fantastic lot of resources online. Just Google Home Office Indicative Integration 2019, and you'll find a whole lot of interactive resources as well as reports and so on. But what I was going to say, I think the development's been really interesting. So I think it'd be fair to say that immediately after publication of the initial framework, things went very quiet in the Home Office. That would be our perception anyway, wouldn't it, Alastair? But Scotland being a smaller place, I'm sorry my Scottish Refugee Council colleagues are not here, because actually Scottish Refugee Council really picked up and ran with the framework. And because they did that, we found ourselves with the credibility of actually, practice examples of how you implement this. And in particular, they really picked up with the social connections dimension of the framework, and they found the categories of bonds, bridges, and links, which we talked about, really helpful, because they shape their services there in terms of thinking, well, how do we support the building of bonds, relationships with people who are like yourself, but also let's have integration networks, that's the term they used, that are really all about building bridging relationships. And so that's investing in community development that involves both refugees and host communities. And then the links also, they were kind of aware of and were recognizing what was being done on that level. So I think that was really helpful. So when Home Office came back to being open to it, there was something to look at, and actually it was being picked up in other parts of the world by that stage as well. But I just wanted, yes, to link in with what you said, Ed, about measurement and how tricky that is. And for me, if you ask me about the original research, before we even had the framework, what shouted at me was social connections were what really mattered to people. You know, that's what lay at the heart of their experiences. So with that in the back of my mind, we're then thinking about measurements and indicators and so on. But as Ed says, and as many other people say from other contexts, it's really difficult to capture social connections in a sort of non-labor intensive way, in a way that's concrete enough to be usable by policymakers. And so that really is what prompted us here in our research group to invest in looking at social connection, and particularly the measurement of social connection. And as we've heard today, you know, so many people already, anyway, we're doing all sorts of really interesting research around social networks and the protective impact of those. So yeah, I think that's a key. And in terms of research, there's been loads of research, it should be mentioned. The Sussex group, Linda Morris, the Birmingham group, Jenny Phillimore, the Sterling group doing work with adolescent migrants and families and so on. Neil Quinn, who we heard from this morning, and Daniela Simon, and lots of people at Strathclyde. There's lots of filling in research that's gone on around the domains and the relationships between the domains. So I think that's really consolidated our knowledge. Yeah.
Thank you, Alison. Alastair, anything you would like to add?
Yes, a couple of things, I think, and perhaps quite explicitly as an academic in trying to understand how that's happened. So I am both proud that there was enough of an engagement in the framework for the Home Office to be even to consider revisiting it. That's a real achievement. It often, things are published, they go into the ether, they're not used. So the fact that people want to refine it is brilliant. The fact that the Scottish Refugee Council and others picked up on it with, you know, huge assets. The fact that, and most people have heard this story, but it is worth saying, the fact that our initially rejected paper on the basis that this was at best mid-level theory has become the most cited paper in the history of the Journal of Refugee Studies is an important principle about what academic life is about. This is not a high theory model. It tries to connect with some of those debates, those political debates, but it tries to connect with language that an NGO, a civil society organization, that the Home Office, that academics can engage with together. I did a small blog about a year ago called On Bricks and Visions, and I think this work really elaborates that well. As a researcher, are you a brick builder? Do you do one brick at a time, build a wall, or do you come up with visions? And if you're either of those in the extreme, you're potentially, I think, a waste of time. You can have these wonderful visions of critique of the system, but you're not collecting data, you're not identifying indicators, you're not mobilizing evidence with respect to that. But equally, if you're just collecting bricks and just collecting things you can measure and not looking what's this building towards. And so what I've been delighted that the framework has done, through people critiquing it and engaging with it and saying what's missing, has been this wonderful chemistry, alchemy of the mix of the two. I share Alison and Ed's thought. It's actually interesting. It's called the Indicators of Integration Project, but we didn't call the paper that's been widely cited Indicators of Integration. I think it's Understanding Integration, because I remember working through the indicators and providing them, you know, each domain, I think there's 4 or 5 proximal and distal indicators. And there's been some utilization of that, and it's absolutely appropriate that those were refreshed. But I don't think that was the major achievement. That's not why it's cited. I suspect most people that cite it have never even looked at those indicators. The domain word is really important. The domains that give us some sense of the phenomenology, of something of the reciprocal experience, something of the bounds of this concept, and ways of thinking about it, if not absolutely measuring it. So I think that the domain structure has been really important. But just then to reinforce it in terms of this meeting, whilst acknowledging it's difficult, I think it's a hugely important insight that the middle row of that framework is about social connection. I think it continues, because it's difficult to measure, potentially to be ignored. That I thought Eric's presentation, which I caught this morning, you just perfectly put this. It's in these small intimacies of kindliness, neighborliness, which couldn't be from a professional worker who is a human, who is a friend as well as a service provider. It's that which drives integration, which means it drives employment. It means it drives accommodation. It drives leisure opportunities. And if you just measure leisure opportunity. You just measure accommodation. You just have your policy targeted at that. And you don't understand the engine that drives that as being very significantly about how people meet, how people experience that meeting, then we're not going to advance very far. And just one anecdote of a local thing, which I have to be slightly careful how I tell it, but just how easy it is to forget the importance of that, particularly in an emergency response. I'm thinking about Edinburgh and I'm thinking about the Ukraine response. And clearly accommodation is really important. Clearly schooling is very important. And social integration was seen as a luxury in those early days here. The idea of actually ensuring that people connect to local people, have a sense of welcome, seemed like somehow as not the priority. And I sort of understand that in terms of the health needs and so forth. And that actually led to an investment in taking groups of groups of Ukrainian refugees from an airport hotel to the zoo to have a good day out. A nice idea. No preparation made for them to meet with any Scots, any local people. What a waste. What an ignorant response to understanding really what welcome's about. Incidentally, there was one volunteer there who's identified some needs within that group, who's connected. It's the perfect little illustration of these informal networks. And that's what we want to magnify across the city, across the country. Is just facilitating those. And they're absolutely, Ed, you're right, they're hard to measure. They really are. I completely acknowledge that. But to find ways of doing so and to now respect the evidence base, that it's the facilitation of those humane encounters that are not just nice things to have, but they facilitate employment, they facilitate security, they facilitate language learning, they facilitate getting your driving license, they facilitate you putting your citizenship papers together, and they're really important.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for emphasizing the relational approach to integration. I know Ed has been trying to raise his hand to say something, so Ed, please join in.
No, that's helpful. That fits in quite nicely with what I was going to say. So as you can imagine, at the Home Office, and particularly at the moment, a lot of the focus is on indicators such as employment, housing, and learning English. And the kind of I don't know, hard indicators is the wrong word, obviously, but the kind of things that people see as key to kind of self-sufficiency. But actually, how do you make progress in those? It's not as simple as just improving support at job centres or adult education institutions. Actually, and again, we draw on the indicators of integration a lot, but what we try and sort of highlight as analysts in the Home Office is the kind of holistic nature of integration, and particularly, as you were saying, perhaps the social connections element of it is kind of been seen historically as kind of the soft bit of it or the kind of luxurious bit of it, but that's not the case at all, really. So just to provide some evidence to that, so like I was saying, my team works on the evaluation of the resettlement schemes, and a lot of you will be aware that there's kind of two different routes that people can come via, and one is to be resettled by a local authority, and one is to be resettled by a community sponsorship group, which are often kind of faith-based groups, but all sorts of groups can apply to be sponsors. And actually, the preliminary evidence that we have does suggest that outcomes may be better for those resettled by community sponsor groups than local authorities. We do need to do more kind of research to control kind of differences in cohorts, that kind of thing. But it does look like there are particular strengths to the community sponsorship approach, and perhaps that is part of kind of the building social capital and building kind of a network of support that refugees can draw on. And part of what the Home Office is trying to do at the moment is build community sponsorship in a sustainable way. And I think, obviously, in terms of capacity, I don't think we're ever going to be able to replace the need for local authorities to support refugees. We're never going to be able to grow community sponsorship to the extent where local authorities won't need to be involved, but perhaps there are things we can learn from the community sponsorship approach that we could potentially use to support refugees who are being supported by local authorities.
Thank you, Ed, for that. Carolyne, I think you raised your hand because you wanted to say something, and after that, I will drive you to the last question of the panel, so we can have a bit of Q&A as well.
I just want to mention, I think Alison mentioned that basically I was driving this, and I just want to mention that, a piece of work like this can never happen if you don't have the right leadership, the right culture, the right attitude. And I would say at the time that we commissioned this piece of work, this would never have taken place if we didn't have the right integration leads, you know, in IRS at the time. So we had some very progressive policy customers who were genuinely interested in knowing about, you know, the real evidence base that needed to underpin their policy. So the drive to understand the truth came from the policy colleagues as well. And I think when we updated this framework, this is only possible. I couldn't do that if I didn't have the right directors, the right policy colleagues supporting this work to take off. So I really want to say this is really a function of a whole group of people in the Home Office who genuinely believed in making things happen for refugees. And we had some really, really progressive policy directors who were keen to put their money where their mouth was. So it's thanks to all of them that we are celebrating this work today. So it's really not something to do with one in particular person. So it was because of them that we could commission you, and they were quite pleased to continue to commission this work even when we got to the second one. So I really do hope that we continue to have very progressive policy customers like that, that can drive the truth from bottom up. So it's thanks to them as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Caroline. Thank you to recognize those hidden social connections as well that allow this work to happen. We have two last questions, but I'm going to put them together. And I know that it's difficult, but I would like to ask if you can keep your interventions 2 minutes so we can actually have a Q&A. Has been fascinated to see how you came to work together, how the work has developed, but we really want to know, how do you see this going forward? And also, having listened to the presentations today from different colleagues doing research, drawing, you know, in the relational approach of social connections in relation to integration, what are your thoughts on the future on the social connection, and even on the indicator of integration, which Caroline emphasized that actually changed because the time changed as well. You saw the need to update in 2019. So just thinking a bit about the future. Can we start with you, Ed, online, if that is okay?
Sure, thank you. So I certainly hope that the most recent version of the indicators of integration will see us through for another decade or two. It's difficult to imagine what will change in the future. I'm sure stuff will change in ways we can't even imagine. So it's a good question, but it does develop, and new kind of supporting resources do become available. So it wasn't mentioned today, but for example, IOM have produced some guidance for practitioners to use the indicators of integration. So if you're interested in a maybe slightly more practical guide to using it, please do search for that online. It's easy enough to find. I just say for us, we will kind of continue to kind of stress the kind of holistic nature and interrelated nature of the different integration domains. For us, really, our priority is kind of developing the evidence base. So actually, you may kind of think, you might be under the impression that Home Office has kind of better data and evidence relating to integration than it does. Actually, I was quite surprised when I joined that there is a bit of an evidence gap there. So particularly once refugees are granted asylum, we actually don't have very good data on what's happened to them afterwards. So particularly things like secondary migration, if they move on from dispersal areas, or outcomes in things like employment. There's very little data available, and that's because they don't tend to be picked up in kind of social surveys due to the size of the group, and also they don't tend to get kind of flagged on kind of government administrative databases. So that's what we're trying to address, really. But that in itself is a big challenge for several reasons. So it has been attempted before. So some of you may be aware in the late 2000s that the Home Office ran something called the Survey of New Refugees. So again, that generated quite useful evidence on people granted asylum over a particular period. But the trouble, there was a large amount of attrition over time, and it's actually quite difficult to maintain contact with refugees to follow up on outcomes, particularly over the longer term. I think that survey went up to around 2 years after grant, and then kind of dropped off, and it wasn't feasible to measure beyond that. So what we're trying to do at the moment is link the data that we hold on refugees to administrative data that's held by other government departments, and we're working with the Office of National Statistics to do that. So we hope to kind of build up a longitudinal study of refugee outcomes, things like employment, benefits, health services, to actually really explore what is the journey for people granted asylum or who arrive by the resettlement route, you know, from sort of the moment they're granted status arriving in the country up to say 10 years after they've been in country, to hopefully understand the barriers and kind of the things that do work to promote integration. So hopefully that's a really exciting piece of research that's been a long time in development, and hopefully over the next year or so we'll start to actually see some outputs from that work.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Ed. And of course, the IGHD is still here. So if you want to commission any new job, we are ready to go on the ground. Please, can I ask your 2 minutes to the panelists here? Where do you see this going? So if I can ask you to keep it in 2 minutes. Alison, would you like to go first now?
Right. I'd like to really applaud what you've just been telling us, Ed, about that collecting longer term data. Can I plead that we don't just do it for resettlement refugees, but also people who've come through the asylum route? Because I do think that the longer term perspectives and therefore longer term data is absolutely the key. And to me, that will demonstrate exactly what Alastair was saying a minute ago, i.e. that the social connections bit is the essential bit that makes everything happen. So I suppose the key things I would say is, if we just count people getting into employment, then we are much more likely to have ghettoization, because we celebrate that all the Chinese are in Chinese takeaways because they're in a job. They may not be speaking English, they may not be able to do educational qualifications, they're just stuck there. That's just one example, but so please, can we look at sort of long-term trajectories around self-development, because that is also the argument for the country as a whole, that, you know, enabling people to make the best contribution to society they can. And that doesn't need to be for refugees at the expense of the rest of the population. That's a general message, isn't it? That we need to invest in enabling all members of society to make the best contribution they can. So just to finish with, I think that the research that we've heard today actually is really exciting in the nuances it brings out. And I mean, one of the things I picked up from this morning, I think the work that the group have been doing around social connection has already given us granular understanding that refugees need a certain kind of support in those first 6 months, which is about access, but also it's critical what kind of meaning is communicated in terms of a sense of welcome and value. So we know stuff about that. I think we could do more with what we know. But then also we recognize that's not the end of the story, and we need to learn more about the kind of, as I say, the long-term trajectory. And to me, that would be about this being human thing that Emma, I don't know if you're still online, but I was going to say this anyway, you know, ultimately, we need to get away from the charity model of being kind to the poor refugees for a short while, to recognizing that migration is here to stay. We need to learn how to live together in mutually productive ways. So we need to focus in on recognizing our fellow humanity, so that we're not competing with each other, but we're building together.
Thank you, Alison. Carolyne?
I think one of the biggest challenges we had in integration was the ability to compare interventions, to compare outcomes across different groups, so that we can develop bespoke interventions. I think the framework now gives us that opportunity to collect standardized data, and also give us, I think, the opportunity to compare, not just locally, not just between projects, but also across projects, and, you know, between national and international context. So it'll be interesting to look back, you know, to look back in 10 years to see whether we now have the data that would give us the kind of nuanced information that we need to support those who are most disadvantaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Alastair?
Just two thoughts. I mean, one, I've left direct engagement with the framework work for significant number of years, and it's just delightful to see through the efforts of Alison and many others, but I want to signal out Alison, of continuing with that baton. But it's an important effort, Alison, and it's delightful when work is taken up and is not dependent in any way on you, on one. And I know Alison is looking forward to that in terms of her own retirement. the sense of the baton being passed on. That's an important academic principle. It's an important principle about knowledge, that it's not owned by individuals, it's not associated with individuals, but it's a common good that we share the insights that we've worked on. In terms of my own work, which is sort of continuing post my own retirement, what was interesting again about this morning is, I think, just the central importance of informal community resources and engagement, which are hard to map. It's hard in international or national policy to exactly understand what's happening, but whether it's resettlement processes during Ramadan in Erbil, which I have more insight into, I guess, than anyone else in the room, where I'm told internationally nothing happens during Ramadan. There's no refugee processes there, where you travel and you find that people are being hosted and provided meals at iftar meals at the end of the day. There's a whole informality of hugely important activities, which I completely recognize for government policy colleagues are really hard to get a handle on. But we can probably do a better job of mapping and measuring some of those and hugely informing government policies, international policies, of how to utilize those resources and those agendas and those energies that come from communities themselves.
Brilliant. Please join me to thank our panelists, Dr. Alison Strang, Carolyne, Alastair, and Carolyne.